Picture a medieval castle. You know the one. Gray stone walls, freezing cold, dark corridors lit by a single flickering torch. A knight sits shivering in full armor, while rain leaks through the ceiling. Maybe there is a rat. There is always a rat. That image lives in the heads of millions of people, because every movie, every television show, and every video game has been selling it for decades. The grim, miserable castle where everyone is cold, everything is dark, and nobody is having a good time. But historians who actually study medieval domestic life have a very different picture, and it is not just slightly different, it is dramatically different. Because the castle you just imagined in your head probably never existed. At least not the way you think it did. However, the real answer is more complicated than just saying castles were actually nice. Some of them genuinely were cold, drafty, and uncomfortable. Others were designed with a level of sophistication that would surprise anyone who has only seen them as ruins. And the difference between those two extremes comes down to three things: when the castle was built, where it was located, and how much money the owner had to spend on making it livable. So were medieval castles actually cold and miserable to live in? The answer spans 1,000 years of European history, and it starts with the castles that actually were pretty rough. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the earliest stone castles in England and France were exactly the kind of place you would not want to spend a winter. These were motte and bailey structures, essentially a wooden or stone tower built on top of a mound of earth, surrounded by a fenced enclosure. They were designed with one purpose in mind, and that purpose was not comfort, it was survival. The keep, that central stone tower, was where the lord and his household retreated during an attack. Thick stone walls could stop arrows and resist fire. But those same thick stone walls had a side effect that nobody talks about in the history books. Stone is a terrible insulator. It absorbs cold from the outside and radiates it inward. So in winter, living inside an early stone keep was like living inside a refrigerator made of rock. Heating came from a single central hearth placed in the middle of the main room. A fire burned on the floor, and the smoke had to find its own way out through a hole in the roof or through small vents in the walls. Picture that for a moment. An open fire in the center of a stone room, smoke filling the air with nowhere efficient to go. Your eyes are stinging. Your clothes smell like a campfire permanently. The ceiling above the hearth is black with soot, and the corners of the room furthest from the fire are still freezing cold. Windows in these early castles were tiny, narrow openings designed to let in just enough light while keeping out arrows. No glass, just wooden shutters, or maybe oiled cloth stretched across the opening. Close the shutters, and you are in near total darkness. Open them, and you are letting the winter wind blow straight into the room. So for this specific era, the stereotype is actually pretty close to reality. Early medieval stone keeps were smoky, dark, and cold. The people living in them wore heavy wool and fur clothing indoors, and basically endured winter rather than enjoyed it. But here is where the story takes a turn that completely changes the picture. Starting around the 12th century, castle design underwent a revolution, and the single biggest change had nothing to do with military technology. It was the fireplace. Moving the fire from the center of the room to an exterior wall sounds like a minor adjustment. It was not. It was one of the most important domestic innovations in European history. By building a stone hearth into the wall and adding a hood and flue to channel smoke outside, medieval engineers solved the two biggest problems of indoor heating at the same time. Smoke went outside, heat stayed inside. The earliest chimneys appeared in Norman England around the 11th century, but the technology spread slowly. By the 14th century, chimneys were common throughout European homes and castles, and once builders figured out that vertical chimneys using natural drafts pulled smoke upward far more effectively than horizontal vents, the system worked beautifully. Early fireplaces were enormous. We are talking about openings so large that you could literally sit inside them to get closer to the flames. This was not just showing off, although medieval nobles certainly enjoyed that. Those massive openings maximized heat radiation into the room, while the thick stone backing absorbed warmth and reflected it back like a thermal mirror. And castles did not stop at one fireplace. A high-status castle from the 13th or 14th century might have multiple fireplaces in every major room. Bodiam Castle in East Sussex, built in 1385, had 33 fireplaces throughout the building. 33. That is not a cold, miserable fortress. That is a building designed with serious attention to keeping people warm. Of course, all that fire needed fuel. Castles could burn through entire forests each winter, feeding those fireplaces. Environmental sustainability was not exactly a medieval priority, but comfort improved dramatically. Now here is something that will completely change how you picture a medieval castle interior. Those bare, gray stone walls you see in every ruin you have ever visited, they are lying to you. When medieval castles were actually being lived in, almost none of them had exposed stone on the interior walls. The stone was covered, plastered, whitewashed, and in many cases painted with bright colors and elaborate decorative patterns. We know this because paint fragments survive on walls at sites like Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, where you can still see traces of medieval wall painting if you look carefully. And in rare cases where interiors were preserved, like the Palais des Papes in Avignon, France, the walls are covered floor to ceiling with vivid painted scenes. Medieval people loved color. They lived in a world where most everyday objects were brown, gray, or undyed wool. So when they could afford pigment, they used it everywhere. A high-status castle room in the 13th or 14th century would have been painted floor to ceiling, often in patterns that imitated more expensive materials like marble or exotic stone. Imagine walking into what you thought was a bleak stone room and finding it covered in deep reds, rich blues, emerald greens, and gold accents. That was the reality. The bare stone skeleton we see today is just that, a skeleton. The living body of a medieval castle looked completely different. But paint was just the beginning. Because the most important wall covering in any medieval castle was not paint, it was fabric. Tapestries were not just decoration. They were medieval insulation technology disguised as art. Thick woven wool and silk hangings covered the stone walls, and they served multiple practical purposes at the same time. They blocked drafts from seeping through gaps in the stone. They added a layer of insulation that trapped warmth inside the room, and they absorbed sound, turning echoey stone chambers into spaces where you could actually hold a conversation without shouting. These tapestries were incredibly valuable. A skilled weaver could complete roughly 1 square meter of tapestry per month, according to the Victoria and Albert Museum. A large wall hanging 20 feet wide could take a team of weavers months or even years to finish. They depicted scenes from history, mythology, religion, and daily life, and they were among the most prized possessions a noble family owned. Here is a detail that shows just how important tapestries were. When a lord traveled between his various castles and estates, the tapestries went with him. They were rolled up, loaded onto carts, and transported from residence to residence. The furniture traveled too. A great lord might rotate through 5 or 6 castles in a year, and his household furnishings, including tapestries, bedding, and even dismantled furniture, followed him on the road. This explains something that confuses a lot of people. Why is there so little surviving medieval furniture? Because it was designed to come apart and travel. Tables, chairs, and chests were built to be disassembled, packed, and reassembled at the next castle. When a noble family stopped using a particular castle, the furnishings left with them. What remained was just the empty stone shell. Now let us talk about windows, because the evolution of medieval windows is one of those stories that shows just how much castle comfort changed over the centuries. In the early medieval period, windows were small, narrow openings covered by wooden shutters. When the shutters were closed, the room was dark. When they were open, the room was cold. There was no good option. People tried everything to solve this problem. Oiled cloth stretched across the opening let in a diffused glow of light while blocking some of the wind. Treated animal skins worked similarly. Thin sheets of cattle horn, painstakingly flattened and fitted into window frames, were more translucent than cloth and offered better weather protection. They distorted your view of the outside world, but they let light in without letting the cold follow. Glass existed, but it was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford. In the early medieval period, glass windows were found almost exclusively in churches and the most important rooms of royal castles. The glass itself was thick, uneven, and often colored. Producing large, clear panes was extremely difficult and expensive. So when glass was used in a castle, it appeared in small sections pieced together within a frame of lead strips, creating those distinctive diamond-patterned windows you see in surviving medieval buildings. By the 13th and 14th centuries, glass became more common in high-status castles. Larger windows, including Gothic-style pointed arches, began appearing in the great halls and private chambers of wealthy lords. Drapes, shutters, and curtains could be drawn over the glass for additional insulation at night. This is where the castle experience split dramatically depending on your social class. If you were a lord sitting in your solar, the private withdrawing room off the Great Hall, you might be looking through actual glass windows at the countryside beyond. If you were a servant sleeping in the ground floor dormitory, you were dealing with oiled cloth and wooden shutters. Same castle, completely different experience. Speaking of things that varied depending on your status, let us talk about the medieval bathroom, because the garderobe is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated features of castle design. The garderobe was a medieval toilet built directly into the castle walls. It projected outward from the exterior of the building on stone supports called corbels, and the design was simple but effective. A stone seat with a hole in it sat above a vertical shaft that dropped waist down the outside of the wall into the moat, a river, or a cesspit at the base. The lord's private chamber almost always had its own garderobe attached, essentially a medieval ensuite bathroom. The Great Hall usually had one in the corner. Everyone else shared communal facilities, and everyone, including the lord, kept a chamber pot for use at night. Some castles took this surprisingly seriously. Bodiam Castle had 28 garderobes, each with its own chute, discharging directly into the moat. 28 toilets in a single building was a number that matched the greatest royal palaces of the era. Pairs of garderobes, separated by a dividing wall, were not uncommon, and some were accessed through short passageways with right-angle turns for privacy. But the garderobe had a feature that nobody expects when they first learn about it. The name itself is a clue. Garderobe translates roughly from French as garde the robes. In many castles, the latrine was attached to a larger dressing room or solar, and wealthy nobles actually hung their finest clothes, wool tunics, velvet cloaks, fur-lined garments, directly over the toilet shaft. Why? Because the ammonia fumes rising from the waist below killed moths and fleas. Medieval people had figured out that the stench from the garderobe shaft served as a natural insecticide for their expensive clothing. It was disgusting by modern standards. It was also genuinely clever. Of course, the garderobe also had a catastrophic security flaw, which became obvious during the siege of Château Guillard in Normandy. Richard I of England had built the fortress on the River Seine in the late 12th century. It was considered one of the most technologically advanced castles in Europe. But in 1203, French soldiers besieging the castle found an entry point that nobody had thought to defend. They climbed up through the latrine shaft, reached the chapel above, and ended the siege from inside the walls. After the castle changed hands, the new owners walled off the shaft exit. Some lessons you only learn once. Now, if you were picturing castle life as a grim survival exercise at this point, the Great Hall is where that image falls apart completely. The Great Hall was the largest and most impressive room in any medieval castle, and it functioned as far more than just a dining room. It was the administrative center where the lord held court and settled disputes. It was the social hub where the household gathered for meals, entertainment, and communal life. And on feast days it was transformed into something genuinely spectacular. The lord and lady sat at a raised dais at one end of the hall, a clear display of their status and authority. The highest-ranking guests occupied the high table alongside them. Everyone else sat according to rank, extending down the length of the hall. Dogs lounged near the tables, waiting for scraps. Servants circulated constantly, keeping cups filled and platters replenished. Feasts in the Great Hall were not quiet dinners. They were events. Minstrels performed songs of love and heroism. Jesters entertained with jokes, tricks, and acrobatics. Jugglers, dancers, and sometimes even fire-eaters appeared at grand banquets. At the most elaborate celebrations, heralds and trumpeters sounded fanfares to announce the arrival of each new course, adding ceremony and theater to the dining experience. And the food itself was far from the bland gruel that popular culture sometimes implies. At a noble feast, you might see roasted swan or peacock served with the feathers reattached for dramatic presentation. Spiced sauces made with imported cinnamon, ginger, pepper, and saffron accompanied the main courses. Multiple dishes of meat, fish, bread, cheese, fruit, and pastries arrived in succession. Wealthy households imported wine from France and southern Europe, while ale brewed on site flowed freely for everyone else. The operation behind these feasts was enormous. Castle kitchens were usually housed in separate buildings to reduce the risk of fire spreading to the main structure. The head cook directed a team of assistants, bakers, brewers, and scullions, managing the daily task of feeding an entire household that could number in the hundreds. Bread alone required a dedicated bakehouse operating from dawn. Brewers produced gallons of ale daily. Roasting meat on turning spits was a full-time job handled by dedicated kitchen servants. If you want to subscribe, now is a good time. We cover the surprising history behind everyday assumptions every week. Now let me show you where the class divide inside a medieval castle gets really interesting. The popular image of a castle treats everyone inside as equally miserable. Cold stone, drafty corridors, universal suffering. But medieval castles were highly stratified environments where your experience depended entirely on where you fell in the social hierarchy. At the top, the lord and his family lived in genuine comfort, at least by the standards of their era. The lord's private chambers typically occupied the most sheltered part of the castle. He had his own fireplace, his own garderobe, glazed windows, tapestries on the walls, and heavy curtains around his bed for warmth and privacy. The solar, a private withdrawing room, gave the lord and lady a space to escape the noise and public nature of the great hall. In 1386, records from Pembroke Castle specifically describe private rooms off the main hall that were heated by their own fireplaces. The connection between privacy and heating was explicit. If you could afford your own chimney, you got your own room. The lady of the castle occupied similarly comfortable quarters. Her chambers were furnished, heated, and decorated with care. She had access to the same amenities as the lord, and her household of attendants and ladies-in-waiting occupied adjacent rooms. Below the noble family, garrison soldiers and household knights had more basic, but still sheltered quarters. They slept in shared rooms, sometimes in halls of their own, with access to the communal fireplaces and the food prepared in the main kitchen. Their living conditions were rougher than the lord's private chambers, but dramatically better than anything available outside the castle walls. At the bottom, servants slept dormitory-style in shared quarters, often on straw mattresses on the floor near the kitchens or in whatever space was available. They worked long hours, ate simpler food, usually bread, pottage, and whatever leftovers came down from the noble table, and had the least access to heating and comfort. But even the servants in a castle were, in many ways, better off than the average peasant outside the walls. A peasant cottage in the medieval period typically had a dirt floor, a thatched roof, a single room shared with livestock, and a central fire with no chimney. The castle servant at least had stone walls that kept out the worst of the weather, regular meals, and access to the communal resources of a large, organized household. This is an important point that gets lost in the way we talk about medieval castles. We compare them to modern homes and find them lacking. But the relevant comparison is to everything else that existed at the time. And by that measure, even a basic castle was among the best-built, best-equipped structures available to anyone in medieval Europe. Seasonal changes made a significant difference too. Winters were challenging everywhere in the medieval world because no one had anything resembling modern heating. But castle residents adapted. In cold months, households moved to smaller rooms that were easier to heat. Communal sleeping arrangements allowed people to share body heat. Braziers, portable metal containers filled with burning charcoal, could be carried from room to room for extra warmth. Heavy wool and fur clothing was worn in layers, indoors and outdoors alike. The idea that medieval people simply suffered through winter without complaint misunderstands how adaptation works. These were people who had never experienced central heating. They did not miss what they had never known. They dressed for the cold, they built fires, they hung tapestries, and they got on with life. Was it as comfortable as a modern heated house? Obviously not. Was it constant freezing misery? For most castle residents, most of the time, no. Now let me show you a specific castle that demolishes the cold and miserable myth more effectively than any argument. Bodiam Castle sits in the countryside of East Sussex, England, surrounded by a wide moat filled with water lilies. If you asked a child to draw a castle, they would probably draw something that looks like Bodiam. 4 round corner towers, crenellated walls, a massive gatehouse. It is the picture book castle. Sir Edward Dallingridge built Bodiam in 1385, officially to defend against a French invasion that never actually happened. But the castle tells a different story than pure military function. Many historians now consider Bodiam to be more of a gentleman's fortified manor house than a serious military fortress. The walls are actually quite thin compared to genuine military strongholds. The gun loops are often positioned incorrectly for effective firing. The moat, while wide and impressive, could have been drained by breaching the retaining bank. Where Bodiam truly excelled was in comfort. Those 33 fireplaces and 28 garderobes were not military features. They were domestic luxuries. The castle had separate suites for the lord and his family, for guests, and for the garrison, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of privacy and household hierarchy. The Great Hall was positioned on the south side of the castle to maximize natural light and warmth. Private chambers featured elaborate window seats and decorative stonework. Large windows let in far more light than military necessity would have allowed. Bodiam was, as one scholar described it, quote, an old soldier's dream house. Dallingridge had made his fortune fighting in France and returned home to build himself the castle equivalent of a luxury retirement property. Designed to look intimidating from the outside while being comfortable on the inside. The architectural version of a man wearing a suit of armor to a dinner party. And Bodiam was not unique. By the 14th and 15th centuries, castle design across England, France, and wealthier regions of Europe had shifted decisively toward residential comfort. The great chateaux of the Loire Valley in France were essentially palaces with decorative battlements. Windsor Castle evolved from a Norman military fortress into a sprawling royal residence with heated chambers, glazed windows, and elaborate furnishings. So if many medieval castles were actually comfortable, colorful, well-heated spaces designed for living as much as fighting, why do we all picture them as cold and miserable? The answer involves ruins, Victorians, and Hollywood, and all three have been misleading us for centuries. Start with the ruins themselves. When you visit a medieval castle today, you are almost always looking at a stripped-down skeleton. The tapestries are gone. The painted plaster has crumbled away. The wooden floors have rotted, the furniture left with the last inhabitants. The glass is broken. What remains is bare stone, because stone is the one material that survives centuries of neglect, weather, and looting. Later generations often made things worse. Castles that fell out of use were treated as convenient quarries. Local builders carted away dressed stone for their own projects. Lead was stripped from roofs. Iron fittings were salvaged. Anything valuable or reusable was taken, leaving behind only the material nobody wanted. The Victorians added another layer of distortion. During the 19th century Gothic revival, many surviving medieval buildings were restored, according to Victorian ideas about what the Middle Ages should have looked like. In churches, this sometimes meant scraping off centuries of whitewash and paint to expose the raw stone underneath, because the Victorians believed bare stone was more authentic and spiritually pure. The irony is that in trying to make these buildings look more medieval, they actually made them look less medieval. The original builders would not have recognized the result. Then Hollywood took over. From the earliest adventure films to the latest fantasy epics, movies have consistently portrayed castles as dark, gloomy, and uncomfortable. Torchlit corridors, mud everywhere, knights sleeping in their armor, rats scurrying across cold stone floors. This visual language became so deeply embedded in popular culture that it now feels like historical reality, even though it was invented by set designers. The confusion runs deeper because of a persistent misunderstanding of the term Dark Ages. The early medieval period was called the Dark Ages not because life was dark and miserable, but because we have relatively few written records from that era. The darkness referred to a lack of historical sources, not a lack of civilization. But the name stuck, and it colored how people imagined medieval life for centuries. Everything medieval became synonymous with everything primitive, brutal, and uncomfortable. The reality, as we have seen, is far more nuanced. Medieval castle life was not one thing. It was 1,000 years of evolving technology, shifting priorities, and wildly different experiences depending on when you lived, where you lived, and how much money you had. An 11th century Motte and Bailey castle in northern England during a harsh winter? Yes, that was probably genuinely miserable. A drafty stone tower with a smoking central hearth, no glass windows, and a garrison of soldiers crammed into shared quarters. But a 14th century castle in southern France, owned by a wealthy lord, that was a different world entirely. Plastered and painted walls, tapestries blocking every draught, multiple fireplaces blazing in every major room, glass windows letting in sunlight, a private chamber with its own garderobe, feasts in the Great Hall with music, entertainment, and imported food from across Europe, servants managing every detail of domestic life. The same label, medieval castle, covers both extremes, and everything in between. What the evidence actually tells us is this: medieval people were not fools. They did not build enormous, expensive, labor-intensive stone structures, and then simply accept being cold and miserable inside them. They invested enormous creativity and resources into making their homes comfortable. Fireplaces, chimneys, tapestries, glazed windows, painted walls, heated chambers, private rooms. Each innovation built on the last, and by the later medieval period, the most sophisticated castles offered a standard of living that was genuinely impressive for any pre-industrial society. Was it modern central heating? No. Did they have running hot water? Only in the rarest, most advanced examples would you choose to live there instead of your current home. Probably not. But the idea that medieval castle residents spent their lives shivering in dark, bare stone rooms is a myth. A myth created by ruins that lost their decoration, Victorians who scraped it away, and filmmakers who never bothered to look up what these buildings actually looked like when people were living in them. The castles were not cold and miserable, we just forgot how to see them properly. If you found this interesting, there is a lot more where this came from. We cover the real history behind the myths every week, and the next video is going to surprise you just as much as this one did.